Hi folks, James here and welcome to the Spiro Circle. In my time as a journalist, I've probably heard thousands of pitches from founders or CEOs or PR professionals wanting me to hear their story. It's no secret that journalists receive thousands of pitches and ignore most of them. Now, it's no surprise, right? We can't take on every single story that we get given to us, and we have to decide what's worth telling and what's not. Well, the same is true for investors, right? When they look for companies to fund, they are hearing stories from the founders, and the founders are trying to convince them why they should take their money. Bit more of higher stakes, if you ask me, than just someone writing about them in a newspaper. The point is that each person needs a different element of the story when it falls on their ears. The investor needs to hear some things, the journalist needs to hear other things, and it's the responsibility of the person telling that story to tweak their messaging accordingly. To understand this idea better, I spoke to Ben Wiener, managing partner of Jumpspeed Ventures. So Ben's an investor, but he's also the author of this fiction book titled Fever Pitch. Now, what it does is it follows the story of an investor called Mark, and he learns through lessons along the way how to tweak his message to get the things that he needs. And it reminded me of a book that I read a few years ago called Surrounded by Idiots by Thomas Erickson. You've probably heard of it. It's a global bestseller. And his message is the same. It's when it comes to communication, the responsibility falls on the person to make sure that who hears the information is getting what they need. And it was super interesting because it made me think of the times that I got pitched by founders and they would talk to me on Zoom and they would say, you know what, it's just easier if I share my screen. So I know what's going to happen there. They share the screen and they bring up the pitch deck. And that pitch deck is designed for investors. And that's fine, but that's not what I want to see as a journalist. So it made me think about the way that Ben and I, or an investor and a journalist, are on two sides of the same coin. And it's the founder's responsibility to make sure they tweak their message accordingly. Anyway, we had a long conversation about the book Fever Pitch, about the H.E.A.R.T framework that Ben has developed, and about some of these ideas more broadly. It was really interesting, and I really hope you enjoy it. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I finished your book. I read it over the holidays just now here in Israel, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I
And before
appreciate it.
we dive a bit deeper into it and some of the characters and some of the things that we can touch on, I'd love, please, to find out from you how I should best describe you. So, are you an investor? Are you an author? Are you a storyteller? What hat are you wearing today?
So I describe myself as a professional investor and an unprofessional author.
Okay, wonderful,
I think that's the best way to put it. It's kind of tongue in cheek,
wonderful.
but
Well,
my writing is all tongue in cheek and it's meant to be educational, but also fun and interesting. And I think you get a sense of my approach just from that line.
yeah, definitely. I love that. For those who are listening at home, just to give some context that I may have given at the start of this episode, Ben, you're the author of Fever Pitch, the new book. It's a novel about selling your vision, raising venture capital, and launching your startup. So I want to hear from you exactly your background and experience that led you to this moment and some of the lessons that you felt were necessary to include in the novel that you wrote.
Yeah, so I'll spare the whole roller coaster of my professional trajectory, but 12 years ago, after a bit of a career as an entrepreneur, before that I was an attorney, but most of my professional career was in small companies and big companies. And then I became a venture capitalist and raised my own VC fund. So I had experience on both sides of the table, both pitching startups when I was younger, and now listening to a lot of pitches as an investor, and still continuing to pitch my fund to the investors who put money into my fund. So I just spend like half my time either pitching or being pitched to. So, like many investors, I have tons of experience with pitches. What led me to write the book was two things. A very radical experience when I started to pitch my fund, Jump Speed, at the time to investors, and I completely struck out. I thought I had a lot of passion and a lot of integrity, which I thought I did, and I thought that would be enough to raise money from investors, and it wasn't. I really struck out with investors, and I needed to make a long story short, I realized I needed to modify my pitch. I was still pitching the same thesis, but I needed to restructure the way I was introducing that information to investors, and then it started to click. So that was the beginning of the idea of, hey, you could pitch the same thing, but in different ways, and the way you pitch it can make the whole difference in resonating or connecting with an investor. That was the beginning of the seed of, wait a second, there's something to structure that I need to investigate. And then as an investor hearing a lot of pitches, I started to realize that I was getting frustrated. And my peers were telling me that they were also frustrated with the quality of the pitches. Not the quality of the ventures or of the entrepreneurs, but the actual structure of the information that they were getting and that I was getting didn't seem to match the way my brain was working. So that led me down a rabbit hole, a deep, deep, deep rabbit hole of researching on the web and then in books and other areas. Like, is there such a thing as a structure that is better? Like, is there an optimal structure for pitching startups? And it turned out that there probably was, and I felt that nobody had articulated it conclusively. Like, there had been many, many attempts to tell entrepreneurs what to put in their pitch decks, but nobody had backed it up with deep research. And I decided to dedicate a couple of years of my spare time researching, and that led me to the 5-part framework, the H.E.A.R.T framework, which is in the book, and in general to promote that framework to entrepreneurs. The book was sort of the end of that process where I felt that a normal person would have then written like a 1,000 word LinkedIn post saying, "Hey, I figured it out. Here's the optimal, framework." I instead wrote a 250-page novel to try to teach the same thing because I thought it was fun, and I wanted to. The story kind of germinated in my head, and I wanted to read it. And the only way I was going to read it was if I wrote it. So that's how the book came to be. The book was probably the most inefficient, time-consuming way to teach something simple that you could possibly do, and that's why it was so much fun, because it was a labor of love, and I just so enjoyed putting that story out there. There are many other lessons in the book that you probably stumbled upon, but the primary purpose of the book was to teach basically one chapter's lesson. The rest of it was just sort of a setup to that teaching tool.
I want to dive into the story itself. I have to admit, I'm an avid reader, but I'm not much of a fiction reader.
Right.
I don't know why. It's like a personal thing for me. I read plenty of nonfiction. I very rarely dive into it, so it was very enjoyable for me. So just for those who haven't read the book and aren't familiar with the story, a founder, Mark Edmund, he's got this startup. It's not going so well. He's trying to find. He's got the great idea, but he's not quite catching the attention that he needs or wants, and he gets caught up in this whole other thing. Maybe you could. I don't want to give any spoilers away, so why don't you tell the readers kind of what the story is and why you thought that was the best setting to provide the lessons that you just outlined above.
Yeah, so the whole other thing is life. Life as a startup founder who's struggling to raise money gets very, very bad very quickly, and his life goes into complete extreme mode. The line I was thinking when the story started to germinate was a startup founder who couldn't pitch his startup to save his life until he actually needed to pitch his startup to save his life. Like, what would it look like if you actually needed to pitch your startup to literally save your life from a bunch of mafia gangsters and your family was under threat? Like, God forbid. But wouldn't that be like an interesting way to put the founder through a crucible of learning and understanding the structure? And so I threw him into turmoil. A good fiction author needs to torture the protagonist a little bit, and boy, did I put him through the ringer. The fun part of the book was that a lot of those things, the beginning of those seeds of the events, happen to all of us when we're entrepreneurs. I just took it to a wilder extreme. But I think a lot of entrepreneurs would recognize the beginnings of the problems, and hopefully, of course, God forbid, would ever get to the point where he gets, or worse. So that was the theme that was sort of driving the story, to try to put him into a position where he needed to learn stuff because his life was in danger. And what would that look like? What would the setup be to put him in that position? So that's where I had fun with crafting the story.
It's also the and not just the story beats that the protagonist Mark goes through that you make him suffer, but it's also that feeling that I imagine many entrepreneurs or startup founders feel. It's like the waking up at night and having the panic and the stress and just going to one more demo day or one more experience. It was that feeling that, I mean, I'm not a founder, but even my heart was racing for the poor guy.
Yeah.
I was really enjoying it.
I want to touch on two things that you mentioned because they're so poignant. Number one, you mentioned beats. So you're correct in that the story does have what's called beats. Like in movie writing, screenwriting, and book writing, there's a concept of a beat. There's a story beat. The story goes through certain paces. And deep into my research of storytelling, I started to research movie writing and screenwriting and book novel writing. That's what led me to write this story, because I was originally just looking for answers on, are there other structures of narrative arcs in the world that I can apply to startup land? And what sort of happened was, as I was reading more and more nonfiction about how stories are structured, I realized, wait a second, I can translate these beats or these story structures into our narrow, weird world of startup land. And that's really all I did. I didn't invent anything particularly new. I just took Joseph Campbell and The Hero with a Thousand Faces and Blake Snyder and his book about screenwriting, and I found the common denominators of story structure and beats. And then I just said, well, what are those beats in a startup pitch? So that it's funny that you mentioned the word beats. The
I guess that's the storyteller in me.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess,
Exactly.
yeah.
And by the way, it's funny that you said you're not a nonfiction. Like I am like you. I think we met over books originally because you're working on a very very important column in Calcalis that that promotes books, and that's how I found you in the first place. Like you, 80%, 90% nonfiction. I'm a real reading snob, but I started to realize that there was certain fiction that is so important that it almost is like nonfiction. There's certain iconic fictional stories that are so much part of the culture that they're almost like history books. And I started to get into fiction. Clearly today, even today, like 85% of what I read is nonfiction. But I've allowed myself to start to dabble and there are certain fiction writers who I absolutely love because they're so important and they're so good that they're almost like you're learning as much from their stories as you would from a book about physics or astronomy. So all that reading led me to this writing because I wanted to contribute a piece of writing that taught this thing. And by the way, Fever Pitch hit #1 on Amazon in its three categories, which are all nonfiction categories. It sells as a nonfiction book, even though it's a fictional story, because it's meant to teach something. So it's competing with other nonfiction books, even though it's a story.
No, it's great. I really
Cut you off,
enjoyed it.
though.
And I
You're
wanted
asking me a question. I'll let you finish the question. Sorry.
one of the best bits for me is when Mark, and I won't give a spoiler, but he's really at one of his low points in the book. And what he ends up doing is he takes these two aspects of his life. He takes the entrepreneur life and he takes his personal life. And he identifies the problems, sorry, excuse me, he identifies the problems that he has in both of them, and it leads him to creating the heart structure that you've highlighted. That was my past question, and he realizes they're the same. He realizes that the problems or the challenges, I don't like the word problems, the challenges he has in one life are the same as the other life, and the solutions are the same. So talk to me a bit about the heart structure and what that is, and because I know you promote it in other ways outside of this book. So talk to me a bit about that structure and what founders can learn from that. They're pitching you from an investment point, and they're pitching me from a news point. So
Right.
we could bond over that. But talk to me a bit about the heart thing first.
Okay, so I'll start from inside the circle and I'll work out. So the heart structure, for those that are not familiar with it, is a 5-part structure, a 5-part framework or structure for pitching a high-tech startup. It's an acronym. The letters stand for H is hypothesis, start with why. Every pitch should start off with not a vision statement, not a mission statement, but a belief statement. Something that the founder believes probably about the future of that target market, and hopefully, typically, something that other people don't yet believe. Those are the best opportunities when the founder or their team believes something about the future that others don't yet believe, and they're revealing a future secret to the present investors. So every pitch starts off with H, hypothesis, start with why. E is, and these have to be in order, by the way. Now, I'll explain why. I'll go back outside of the inner circle. But the inner circle is H, hypothesis, start with why. E, enormous stakes. There's a lot at stake. with this belief, like we believe that something is messed up or there's an opportunity that's not being capitalized upon, and the next sentence is there's a lot at stake with some factual evidentiary basis. Like if somebody could figure this out, there'd be a big payout in terms of human life, human happiness, dollars and cents or whatever. And by the way, notice when we introduce the hero of our story, the hero is the solution. The hero comes pretty late into the story. We're setting it up. So what do we believe about the future? H, E, enormous stakes. A, before we even describe our hero, who is the villain? The alternatives are grossly inadequate. A, alternatives grossly inadequate. Here's the current state of play. To further back up our thesis about the problem, we have to explain what's wrong, what the current situation is and why it's so broken. So what are all the current alternatives? What are all the ways that humans, computers, companies address this problem or opportunity, and why are they all messed up? Why are they all inferior? And then finally, the fourth of the 5 pieces of the framework is finally our radically differentiated solution. Not just better, not just optimal, but here's our hero, riding in on his or her white horse to save the day, and our solution is just radically 10x, order of magnitude better. And then finally, the T is not just the team, but specifically the traits and skills of the team. Do they have the specific abilities and capabilities or credibilities to build and sell the thing that we're talking about? And that is the neatly packaged core or foundation of a startup pitch. And often in a pitch, I would say not only are some of those points either not brought up or not emphasized, but I've heard pitches that just don't ever mention any of those 5 things, those elements of those 5 things that really need focus. So, but getting back to the blending of his life, the character's life outside of work and his problem at work, what I'm trying to say there is sort of what happened to me. I was investigating story structures outside of business and outside of startup land, and found that there was just these same structures that frankly have existed since we were cavemen and cavewomen in the cave. Like I'm not bringing anything new to the table other than just new words and terminologies to structures that have existed in human society since the beginning of time. And Joseph Campbell talks about this in his very, very iconic, famous book, Hero with a Thousand Faces. He identified these structures across cultures in mythology and sociology, dating back to the beginning of civilization. This is something like innate in us as humans. It's the way our brains tell stories, but more importantly, absorb new information. And Campbell's secret was then transmitted in the mid-1900s to everybody. Like all the screenwriters in Hollywood got it. George Lucas was sitting with that book when he wrote The Empire Strikes Back. He was mapping the characters according to Campbell's hero's journey structure. So the beats, those structures, pervade human psychology, pervade human sociology. And I'm just translating those known structures into our specific slice of startup land with the H.E.A.R.T framework. So
No, it's amazing. It's super.
It's not a coincidence that he matches what he does in his real life to what he does in his work life. All I'm trying to say is this is the way we tell stories and provide new information as just normal humans when we're talking to each other. For some reason, we're messing it up. When we get into the business seat, we structure them differently. And I'm just giving a structure to do that in our business lives for higher effect.
No, I love that, and I love it. It's so true because there's reasons why these archetypes are archetypes, and there's reason why these story beats are story beats. So in the book, Abe Ferrier, a character that Mark bumps into by chance, he says, quote, "People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it." So it's basically what we've just been saying. It's you got to identify the story and the journey that these founders are on and why. You said you've heard thousands of pitches from startups. I've also heard a lot of pitches from startups, albeit on the other side of things. Why do founders find that message so hard to internalize? The idea that it's not what you're doing, it's why you're doing it. Because that's what I tell people. They say to me, on the news side of things, they say, what do you look for in a startup or a founder? I said, I'm not so interested in the tech. I'm interested in who the person is and why they're doing this. And I'm a people-focused tech journalist. That's kind of how I describe myself. So talk to me a bit about the experience you've had with founders who struggle to kind of get that message.
Okay. So first of all, if people don't recognize that line is a quote which is not attributed in the book. That line is a direct quote from Simon Sinek's famous TED Talk. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And it's sort of a joke because in my author's note, I call out Abe in my author's note saying, this is a guy
Yeah.
who quotes a lot of people and doesn't give them credit, so I'm giving them credit in the author's note because I'm trying to make a joke that even somebody who's such a jerk that he's quoting other famous people and not giving them the credit can be the key to your success. Like you can't judge your mentor may be cloaked in the clothing of an absolute jerk who dresses you down in a public coffee shop, insults you, and quotes people without giving them attribution. Like you said, Abe is the key to Mark's future salvation, but at the time he's a complete jerk. And by the way, there are a couple of funny jokes about Abe. So Abe is the only character in the book who's based on an actual person that I met in real life. I actually had an interaction with an investor who was very similar to Abe, and he completely dressed me down, was completely insulting to me, and in the course of that dressing down and insult, gave me one of the keys to my future success as a throwaway comment. He's like, if you want to take yourself seriously as an investor, you really should do this and this and this. You're an effing idiot. You don't know what the F you're doing. And he hung up the phone. And rather than being, steaming and being angry at him, I thought about what he said. I implemented what he said, and it really changed the course of my business career. So as a homage to that guy, I mapped this character to similarly to what that person had done to me back then. He's the only character in the book who's has any similarity to a real life person. Also, Abe Ferrier is a takeoff, a little secret about the book, which I kind of mentioned in the author's note. Some of the storyline is mapped to a very, very famous fictional novel called The Count of Monte Cristo. And in The Count of Monte Cristo, the character, whose name is Edmond, Mark Edmond, meets in jail a priest named Abbe Faria. And Abbe Faria, who's locked up in jail, gives him a literal treasure map that leads to his future success. So as an homage to the person that I met in my real life, and as an homage to Abbe Faria in The Count of Monte Cristo, Abe Ferrier in the book meets Mark and barks at him a series of instructions that to me really represent a treasure map that Mark needs to follow through the rest of the book to get to his future, hopefully to his future, not, again, no spoilers, but, and there's still plenty of twists at the end, but it's meant as a treasure map. And founders should follow the stuff that Abe Ferrier barks at Mark. Each of those things is carefully placed, and it's meant to be a little bit of a breadcrumb map to future learning. So again, that's sort of a roundabout way of I never answer questions like directly, but that's sort of a roundabout way to give some sort of color to the question. Why is it so important to start with why? So just watch Simon Sinek's famous TED Talk. It's about 13 minutes long. He uses the word believe or belief about 33 times in the talk. And I think people don't do that because it's a little freaky. Like, I'm trying to do business. Why do I want to talk to you about what I believe? And I would go back not only to Simon Sinek, but I quote Professor Steve Blank, who's an amazing, world famous entrepreneur and professor. Steve Blank says the definition of a startup is a faith-based organization seeking to become a fact-based organization. Every startup is like starting a new religion. People don't like talking about religion in business circles. People don't like talking about what they believe. I'm not asking you to talk about what you believe religiously in the business setting. I'm saying, what do you believe about your business that other people don't yet understand? That's the key to opening the door or challenging the investor to see if they, A, already believe what you believe, or more often, are at least open-minded to listening closely because you've challenged them. You've said, I believe something about the future, by the way, that other people might not yet believe. So please listen to me for the next 10, 15, 20 minutes. I'm going to try to prove why I think this is the future, and let's see if you want to come along with me. And I think it's an incredibly classic way to sort of throw down the gauntlet and engage with the person you're talking to, drive your stake into the ground, say, this is what I stand for, this is what I believe. Are you with me or not? Because if you're with me and we're both right, we're going to make a bleep ton of money. Instead of assuming that the investor, I think the other answer to your question is I think a lot of founders believe that if they were invited into a meeting, or in your case, if you took their phone call about a news story, that you already are open-minded about what they want to tell you, so they just blast in like a fire hose shooting with all the information they want to tell you. When in truth, you've invited them because probably you're curious or skeptical, but you're not necessarily committed to writing the story or investing in their company, you want to learn more. So that the founder has to have the awareness, that dual awareness, that they're deeply passionate about what they're doing, but the person who they're talking to, even though they've invited them to have the conversation, is probably looking for a reason to say no, or probably skeptical. So they're going to need to do some convincing, even when the meeting starts, about what it is that they believe, why they think it's important, what the outcome could be. And I think that's why a lot of people trip up in those kind of interactions.
Well, I think it's really interesting because one of the books that came to my mind while I was reading Fever Pitch was Surrounded by Idiots. And the book's premise is basically, no, you're not crazy, just you're not surrounded by idiots in your real world, but what happens is there are basically four types of people, and communication falls on the person receiving the information. Like that's where the breakdown in communication comes from. It's not that you're surrounded by an idiot. It's that you're not doing your job to speak the language that that person needs to hear to get the message out. So one of my biggest pet peeves, when I speak to a founder or I speak to a startup, and let's say, for example, we're on Zoom and they're talking to me and they're telling me about the company, and they say, you know what, actually, it's easier if I share my screen. And for me, that it like kills the conversation, because I know they're going to share the screen, they're going to bring up the investor deck, and now they're going to pitch me the company as if I'm an investor. And I'm thinking, you're not speaking to an investor, you're speaking to a journalist. And what I'm going to be getting from a conversation is different from what you or any other investor or any other journalist would get. So on that note, what are some of the best pitches you've ever received from an investor point of view? And what did they do to either, I assume, get you to invest, or at least to get you to answer the question today?
So the short answer is, when I'm listening, what I'm claiming is, when an investor is listening to a pitch, they're listening for these five things primarily. And they themselves might not even know it, because their caveman or cavewoman brain is sending these signals, and they're not even fully aware of what's happening in their own brain. I wasn't for years, until I started to research it. I'm like, oh yeah, that's how my brain is working. So I think the investors listening for these, it's sort of like, I don't want to go too far off topic, but like in jiu-jitsu, in martial arts, jiu-jitsu is about using the person's force against them. I don't want to make this sound violent, but in a standoff between a founder and an investor, it is a little bit of a confrontation. And in Kyosho Jiu-Jitsu, they've identified like a number of pressure points in the human body that you need to leverage in order to win. I'm just saying, these are the 5 pressure points in the investor's brain that the investor is throwing up to try to, process the information, or try to, in most cases, to shoot down the pitch. So neutralize these 5 things in order, and you've engaged the investor. So I found that my brain was working this way. We polled other investors and found that their brains were working the same way, and then I went to work to write the book. So I think that what's often missed is that, like I said, the pitches just gloss over these 5 pressure points. Have I ever heard the best pitch I ever heard, which I use as an iconic example? I was invited. This ended up resulting in an investment that is, I believe, one of my most successful investments to date. And it all began in a 59.9 second pitch. So it was a demo day of a program that had 55 startups in it. A demo day of 55 startups, one after the other, called Minute to Pitch It. Each one had 1 minute on stage with a gong. And that is torture. That is almost physically impossible to ask a founder to successfully communicate what he or she is doing in under a minute. And so most of them were absolutely terrible. It was just people floundering, and it was a disaster. In my humble opinion, I love the program, but I don't think, and I think they've stopped doing that. I was one of the judges on the panel, and this woman gets up. She had immigrated to Israel. She had a perfect British, like you, just a classic British accent. She had come from London, and it was a field that I was not familiar with. In 59.9 seconds, she delivers this perfectly, and she's a scientist. She was a neuroscientist, no prior background in business, and somehow in 59.9 seconds, she had a gift for explaining very succinctly what I just described, like what she believed about the future, what was at stake, what was currently wrong with the way people were doing things, what her proposed solution was that was 10 times better, and why she and her team were the right people to do it. That was it, all condensed to 59 seconds. My jaw dropped. I cannot claim that I understood everything that she was saying, but it hit all those. It was amazing. It was that just perfect Kyosho Jiu-Jitsu move where she just neutralized the 5 things in order. I went up to her afterwards. I said, listen, I need to meet you for a proper meeting to understand this better, but wow, this sounds like fascinating. And it resulted in an investment that I'm very proud of today. So it can be done in under a minute. And that's the perfect elevator pitch. Typically, it takes a little bit longer to develop it properly. But the beauty of the H.E.A.R.T methodology is that it can condense into an elevator framework. You can expand it out into a 5 or 10 minute demo day pitch. You can expand it further into a 20-minute, 30-minute sit-down pitch with an investor. It can conform to those different formats, and it works equally well in every situation.
It's so interesting because we can bounce across all these different aspects, but really what we're doing is we're talking about storytelling. And what you reminded me just now when you were saying, a founder can do a 1 minute, 3 minute, 30 minute. You reminded me of in another life, I was friends with a lot of stand-up comedians who are almost as annoying as journalists, almost. But they used to say to me all the time, they have a 1 minute set. If they could get up on stage and speak for 1 minute, these are the jokes they would tell.
Yeah.
And then they have a 3 minute set and a 5 minute set and a 10 minute set. And they had structured their communication and their stories, right? Because stand-up comedians, they tell stories unless they're like a kind of one-liner comic. And it's basically just about framing your stories. So we're running out of time, so I want to kind of wrap up, and I want to kind of talk about the legacy of the book. It's only a few months old. It came out earlier this year, but I want to know from you what you hope either current founders or the next generation of founders, what are they going to need to do? What are they going to need to adopt from the book, or what are they going to need to do differently to thrive? So you've given some of the strategies that they can do it. What are some of the ways they can best take on those lessons now?
The best thing that I would ever hear, which I've already heard from a few people, is, oh my gosh, I read your book, or I used the H.E.A.R.T. Like you said, I've published the H.E.A.R.T framework for free. You don't have to buy the book to get the juice. You can just go to feverpitchbook.com, and there's a whole playbook that we invested in and a whole other tool for free that you can use. It's just a fun way to digest it, but you don't have to, buy the book. The proceeds are going to charity. I'm not trying to get rich or famous off the book. It's just a tool to be helpful and to be fun, a fun way to digest it. The most important feedback, therefore, for me is not a 5-star review on Amazon. Thank God I've got plenty of those. The best feedback I would get is a founder says to me, which has happened a few times, oh my gosh, I used this framework, and A, it helped me raise my next round, and or B, I just felt more in control of my material. I felt more confident in that meeting because I was in control of my story. And that by far is the most meaningful feedback. I've already gotten that a few times, and each one of those is just a massive pump of dopamine into my brain of, oh my gosh, I was helpful to somebody. This whole effort of writing this book and all the years that it took and the thousands of hours is just a way of me giving back to the industry that's been so good to me and saying, I think I figured this like 1 or 2 things out. I want to share this with other people. I don't want to keep it in my possession. I want to put it out there and be helpful to other founders, pay it forward to the people who helped me. The book is dedicated to my unknowing mentors, many of whom are sort of referenced in the book. It's a way of giving back. So if somebody can take it and use it and have it be one of the tools in their toolbox for success, that will make me the happiest person in the world. And that's already happened a few times. And I'm looking for more of that kind of positive feedback on the utility of the framework. Not just that it was fun to read, but that they actually used the framework and it helped them do what they need to do and get on with their companies as founders.
Well, Ben, I super enjoyed the book a lot. It taught me a lot about storytelling and communication. It also taught me how to raise money for a company, and it taught me a bit about how to deal with mob bosses. So if that opportunity ever comes up, which I hope it doesn't, I'll have a bit of an idea. One last question for you. We've highlighted it a bit just now, but I just want to drill it home for the folks listening or watching now. What are the best ways that they can get access to this information, whether it's buying the book or downloading the strategies online? What are the best ways to follow and connect and download this content?
Thank you for that. So the website is feverpitchbook.com, and at that website you'll have angles to go buy the book if you want to, or take a right turn and go right into the online playbook, which is free. You get the slides that you need for your 10-slide pitch deck with annotations and interactive explanations of why those details are so important. At the end of that, you get a free pitch generator. So it's not AI, it's the opposite. The founder is the AI. We're pulling this out of you. We're saying, give us the answers to these questions, and the machine will spit back out your perfect elevator H.E.A.R.T pitch. I do have friends that have turned it into an AI, and you can just put your company into their AI, and it'll give you the Ben Wiener H.E.A.R.T pitch. I prefer this method. I'd rather the founders come to it themselves. It's so fundamentally important that I would prefer them to use our question and answer format to get their pitch crafted. But again, either way, just want to be helpful, want to get people on the path to success. And I think this is a way, it's like a free upgrade to, if you have a good pitch, it'll make your good pitch a great pitch. And that's often what you need to have to raise money from bozos like me.
All right, Ben, thank you so much for your time today. It was
Thank you
super
for your time.
enjoyable. I really enjoyed the book. One last thing, one last question. Any other novels lined up? What things do you have lined up ahead? Any other
Well,
sequels, spin-offs, literary universes?
I'm not sure. I did publish another novel before this called Murder at First Principles, which is a totally separate story. It's a crime thriller that's also designed to teach. And that book is teaching Hamilton Helmer's iconic book, Seven Powers, which I think either I or somebody else reviewed on Bibliothèque for Kakalist. So that's one of the most important business books ever written, a little bit hard to digest. So I wrote an entire full-length Agatha Christie-style murder mystery about a serial killer that's using Helmer's book to pick victims so that the authorities need to understand his theories. And it's, again, just sort of a Trojan horse to teach Helmer. I think those were the two things that I felt I understood and that I could teach through a story. If I do have a third, I'll do it. But so far, I have a bunch of ideas, but we'll see if they end up resulting in something that's another writing project.
Well, if they do, we can reconnect here and we'll do a follow-up episode.
Thank you so much.
Ben, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.